our sponsored child in Africa. So now we're going to get back to Genesis. Last week we had a week off for Christmas. Did some topical things. But 2 weeks ago we studied Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 14. Verses 1 and 2 said, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly." Now this is after Hagar returned to Abram, and it sounds like Abram took responsibility back and started keeping the tent peaceful. And some months later, Hagar gave birth, and they named him Ishmael. Then we have 13 years of silence, meaning we don't know what exactly happened except that they aged and Ishmael grew up. So Abram apparently did not speak with God for 13 years. At least he didn't hear from him. Now the first thing that Jesus does when he talks to Abram again is restate their covenant and assure Abram that their plan is still on. And Jesus is implying that God still has plans to give Abram lots of kids, and that plan has not yet begun. And of course this confuses Abram because he thinks that he and Sarai have solved the problem using Hagar, and they've got their kid now. So God doesn't have to worry about this anymore. Now Genesis 17, verses 3 through 8. "Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, And as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." So in this section, God changes Abram's name. His original name, Avram, meant exalted father. But exalted father was the name that he was given by his moon-worshipping father Terah, and he had no choice in it. But now God renames him Abraham, and Abraham means father of many nations instead of just exalted father of one or two kids. So once again, Jesus shows his love to Abram, and it seems that whenever Jesus develops a relationship with people, he renames them. I showed you several cases in the Bible where God renames people. And now verses 9 through 11. "And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant that you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Now before, Jesus said, "Walk blameless before me," but now Jesus gives some more details. You know, Abram didn't walk between the pieces when they made the covenant because he couldn't possibly keep that covenant. But here is a symbol that you can do, Abraham, to remind yourself and to explain to all others how you are special and in my covenant. You will all your males will be circumcised. And he says, "As for you," and that's plural, not just him. It's you and all your descendants, all your relatives. And then they add all of the people in his camp. Anyone who lives with you, anyone who wants to be in your community has to do this. Now, when Paul said that we Gentiles are grafted into the Jewish tree, does that mean we're all supposed to get circumcised? No, they changed that in the New Testament. Paul fought against that idea at the Council of Jerusalem, and the apostles agreed. Gentiles do not follow the old covenant ways because circumcision has been replaced by baptism. Baptism is now the sign and symbol of salvation, not circumcision. So circumcision is no longer required for even Jewish Christians. But in review, we'll just touch on baptism as a replacement for circumcision. And we're going to read this twice today, Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14, because it's a very important text. We'll read it now and we'll read it again later. Colossians 2, 11 through 14. "In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you being dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. So here's Paul. He is writing to a Gentile church in Colossae, that's Turkey, and most of them, or at least many of them, were not Jews. And he says, you have been circumcised without hands. And what does that mean? It means you didn't get cut. There wasn't a guy with a knife there cutting you. And how is this accomplished? It says you were buried with Jesus in baptism and raised by faith from the dead. So in other words, you were uncircumcised in the flesh, but you're still forgiven. So it's clear now that the symbol, a seal of salvation, is now baptism. It's not circumcision. Nowadays, Paul says people are baptized instead of being circumcised. And there's a professor, R. Scott Clark, in our denomination. I think he's a professor at Westminster West. He says that circumcision pointed forward to Christ's death. Baptism points backwards to Christ's death and resurrection. And both are the signs and seals and symbols of faith. So they're the same thing. And we looked at Romans 2. In Romans 2, Paul writes, he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. He is a Jew who is one inwardly, and the circumcision is of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter. So once again, Paul says that circumcision is gone. We don't need it anymore. It's been superseded, replaced. Then in Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, Paul asks, do only circumcised people get the blessings of God's people? He says, of course not. He says, did Abraham have his faith before or after his circumcision? Before. We too have our faith, and then we get the sign and the seal. The sign and the seal come after faith. That's why we're baptized after our faith. Now, there's some implication of this in the Old Testament too, that circumcision would be in your heart rather than the physical cut in the future. And that was in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. So this is an early promise of the new covenant. And the promise is that the new covenant wouldn't require this circumcision. It would be a different kind of a circumcision in your heart instead. So it was always intended that those rituals like circumcision were not meant just to be outward, but meant to be symbols of that which is in you, that you've already got faith. Baptism of infants is how babies get to be in the covenant with the parents and with the church. And so now it's for boys and girls both, because it's a non-surgical procedure. So now we go back to Genesis 17. We're not quite to the new text, but the last verses from last time was verses 12 through 14. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So in other words, this wasn't just for your relatives. It wasn't just your kids. If you had any workers or slaves in your community, they also have to be circumcised. All the soldiers that Abram hired and helped him fight against the enemy armies, they had to do this. Any foreigners who wanted to live in the camp with you had to do this. There were no exceptions. And Meredith Klein points out that the command is related to the curse if you fail to do it. Everyone gets cut. And if you don't get cut, what happens to you? Verse 14 says, you shall be cut off, he shall be cut off from his people. So either you get it cut or you get cut off. I don't know if that's a joke, but it's a play on words that's rather poignant. Now, there is some debate as to whether that means execution or exile or shunning. I don't think it was shunning, because then the people would still be living there. You can't let them stay. But the question is whether you killed them or kicked them out. I'm guessing that pretty much anybody who wanted to stay would get it done. So today we begin with Genesis 17, and we'll read verses 15 and 16 to begin. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. So just like Jesus renamed Abram to Abraham a few verses ago, Now he changes Sarai's name to Sarah. Her name, Sarai, meant princess or woman of strength, and her new name means princess of many women, or woman of strength over many. So just like Abraham, they got their names changed from individually blessed to blessing the world, basically. So Jesus extends the covenant blessing from Abraham to his wife, and he says, she will have a son for you. And that's how you're going to beget many nations. In other words, Jesus says, your plan's not my plan. I know you got plans with Ishmael. Nope, that's not how we're doing it here. I'm going to give you a son through Sarah. Now verses 17 and 18. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, even aside from the fact that we read about laughter here, this passage is really funny. I have a sign on my wall next to my desk. It's a quote from Woody Allen, and it says, want to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. But this is exactly the opposite. God tells Abraham his plans, and Abraham laughs. So this is the human laughing at God. Now, Abraham has completely lost his mind here before God. Abraham thinks that he knows better than God. He's kind of thinking something like this. You know, God, you might be kind of new around here. Maybe you don't realize that I'm 100 years old and Sarah, she's 90 years old. We already took care of this for you. You don't have to worry about it anymore, God. We've got it taken care of. I've got this kid Ishmael, so you don't have to worry about this anymore. That's basically what Abraham is thinking and laughing. It is very easy for us as humans to think that we have God's plans figured out. And then we get upset when God changes his plans. But the truth is, God didn't change his plans. What happened is you didn't know the right plan. So it's not that he changed his plans, it's that you failed to recognize what his plans really were. You misunderstood his plan. Abraham took matters into his own hands. He assumed that it was God's plan all along, and it wasn't. And this happens all the time in the Bible, and it happens all the time in our lives. I'll give you just a few examples. I've preached on this before, but Moses seemed to think, he somehow sensed that his purpose in life was to free his people from Egypt. So what did he do? He killed an Egyptian oppressor. And then he's like, uh-oh, that wasn't actually the plan. And he ran off and hid in the desert for 40 years. So that was not God's plan. David thought that God's plan, he knew he was going to be king. Samuel had anointed him. So he thought, okay, after I kill Goliath, the king will love me, and he'll let me marry one of his daughters, and then I'll be in the family, and I'll be in the royal lineage. That wasn't the plan. He didn't learn that until he hid in the desert for 10 years as Saul tried to kill him. Elijah seemed to think that God's plan was for a revival in Israel. The fire came down out of heaven. All the people saw it. And then he used a sword, and he killed all the prophets of Baal. And he's ready for this great revival, and it doesn't come. And then Jezebel says, I'm sending assassins to kill you, and he runs and hides, and he's totally disillusioned. He misunderstood God's plan. Peter thought God's plan was for the Messiah to take over the world. So he rebuked Jesus when he said he was going to Jerusalem to die. He was wrong. Jesus' plan was not to take over the world yet. In fact, Jesus rebuked him as a tool of Satan because Peter's plans were not God's plans. So how does Jesus respond when Abraham laughs about his plans? Verses 19 to 22. Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. And what didn't you notice about Jesus' response? He doesn't sound angry. Jesus doesn't have a temper like humans do. His ego is not crushed when people laugh at his plans. Though, of course, God will punish mockery if unbelievers are mocking him. But Abraham was not laughing at God in mockery. It wasn't a wicked person. He's just an old guy. He's set in his ways. He's a bit foolish. He's laughing at the promise of a miracle because his faith is small. It's not mocking laughter, it's doubting laughter. And Abraham's doubts don't change the promises of God. Jesus always planned that his friend Abraham would laugh because this is an unbelievable promise. All of us would laugh too. If you were 90 years old and God said you're going to have a baby, you'd laugh too. What? No. It's unfathomable. We just can't understand the power of God or his wisdom. Now, in the future, Abraham will ponder his foolish laughter and repent of it, or he'll at least recognize it as being stubborn, that he was preferring his own plans to God's plans. Abraham is still learning, and yet he's still God's friend. So Jesus didn't get really mad at him for laughing. Jesus also agrees to bless Ishmael, as Abraham had requested. But he says the covenant is not with Ishmael. It will be with your new true son, Isaac, next year. And after Jesus delivers all this great news, he leaves. And then Abraham immediately gets to work. So now we'll look at the last paragraph of Genesis 17. That's verses 23 to 27. So Abraham took Ishmael his son, all who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men from Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very same day, Abraham was circumcised, and his son Ishmael, and all the men from his house, born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So it repeats him twice. Basically, it shows Jesus told him to do it. He immediately did it. And yes, he really actually did it. You get it 3 times. First of all, though, this really shows the amazing leadership skills of Abraham over his household, including all of his workers. These people were really very loyal to Abraham. Now, I doubt that all of them were believers in Abraham's God, or at least maybe they didn't understand. But consider this. Abraham, their boss, comes running around the camp, telling his relatives and all of his workers that God spoke to him and that every man and boy is going to get cut off today. Now, we're not waiting until tomorrow, not next week. We're not scheduling it for next month. Today. Okay, now how would you feel about that? Drop all the jobs you're doing, drop everything, find a knife, and cut all your kids, and then cut yourself, or have somebody else cut you. Okay, you would expect there would be some resistance to this idea, some questioning of his orders, maybe even some questioning of his sanity. What are you talking about? Now, I've been doing some research and thinking about the whole concept of circumcision from a Christian point of view, and also from the ancient Jewish point of view. And I don't claim to understand it with certainty, but I have some theories or observations to make that shouldn't be too sensitive for anybody's hearers. Now, I mean, the topic itself is kind of sensitive, but I'm not going to make it any worse in that sense. Part of the question of circumcision is the origin of the practice. Some people say that this is the very first time anyone ever thought of it, and that God told Abram to do it, and this is the debut of circumcision in the world. Liberals, of course, they claim that circumcision wasn't invented until about 500 or 600 BC in Egypt, while the Jews were in Babylon. And while they were in captivity in Babylon, they heard of what the Egyptians were doing. And so then when the scribes supposedly wrote the whole Old Testament, pretending that it was the original document, they added this whole thing about circumcision as one of their distinctive points. And then those scribes miraculously convinced hundreds of thousands of Jews to cut all their families and themselves based on this newly invented history. Now that seems rather unlikely to me. A bunch of eggheads write a bunch of scrolls and then say, oh yeah, people are always supposed to be circumcised. Go ahead and do it. They're not going to do that. So that seems less likely to me than the truth. There are others who say that the Jews stole this idea from more ancient peoples all over the world, especially Mesopotamia, and that circumcision had already been practiced for many, maybe even 1,000 years or more. In fact, if you look it up on Wikipedia, they claim that there is evidence for circumcision from 40,000 BC in Australia. Now, of course, we don't believe that there is a 40,000 BC. But what I would tend to say is that if this is true, it means that circumcision was done, or at least an idea, right after the flood. And that as the people spread over the world, the sons of Ham and the sons of Japheth, and, that some of them went down to Australia before the continents all broke apart. In which case, they did have circumcision long ago. The same is true of Egyptian art. They date circumcision art in Egypt back to 6,000 BC. I wouldn't say it's that old. However, it is true that there does seem to be evidence that there was circumcision all over the world, perhaps even before Abraham. Thus, when Jesus told Abraham to do it, it may not have been a new idea. It was something they had seen and heard before. And that might also be why Jesus doesn't give a very careful explanation of what to do. They already knew what it meant. All he did was say, cut the flesh off your foreskin. Well, okay, how much? How? Maybe they already knew because other people had been doing it. But maybe they had forgot why they used to do it. One possibility is that they knew about circumcision, but not why they did it. In Egypt, they didn't do it to babies. They did it to boys when they were in puberty, about age 12. And it was always a secret. Boy, the Egyptians were rough. Basically, when you turned 12, a couple of priests would come to your house and grab you and do it forcibly and not tell you it was coming. So that's how it looks in the art anyway. But I think that before the flood even, perhaps, people practiced circumcision. Then the question is why? Well, presumably God told them to do so, but it wasn't commanded in his word yet. Maybe it's one of the things that set righteous people apart from unrighteous people, even before Noah, and then they just forgot why they were doing it. Now, if indeed it is an ancient practice, and one that God approved of or even required, the question is still why? Why this ritual? In the New Testament, we have baptism. Why didn't we have baptism in the Old Testament? It would have been a whole lot easier to baptize, and then you could do it to both boys and girls, men and women. And it would be less uncomfortable and less violent. In history, there's been a very violent side to the practice of circumcision. Sometimes when the Jews ruled Judea and conquered neighboring countries, they forcibly circumcised all the males, both to humiliate them and then to claim that they were Jews, so they wouldn't rebel. Muslims still do this, or at least they have in the last few centuries. Some countries, Muslims force uncircumcised people to get circumcised for humiliation or just to say, now you're a Muslim. In fact, sometimes when the British would go to visit as diplomats to Muslim nations, the Muslim nations would say, you can't see the king unless you're circumcised. And so they would have to be circumcised in order to see the king. But violence is one aspect of circumcision that was never intended. And of course, there was social pressure. If you wanted to be a Jew and stay among the Jews, you had to be circumcised, but they didn't do it to you without your consent. But it really doesn't matter, even if I'm wrong, if circumcision didn't predate the flood, it doesn't matter. The question is, why did God command this strange ritual now, at least? And there's a number of theories that I don't find very convincing. The main theory you'll see on the internet and in books is physical, that there are certain physical benefits to being circumcised. This mostly started about 150 years ago when a famous doctor named Hutchinson in England published a study in which he claimed that circumcised people are far less likely to get venereal diseases than uncircumcised people. Okay, so that's his claim. And so basically he published a pamphlet saying, if you get circumcised, you won't get venereal disease. That's not true, but that's what his study said. And it didn't occur to anyone to notice the stupidity of his study. Which people in the world get circumcised? Jewish people. Jewish people tend to be moral and not sleep around much. So they probably don't get venereal disease because they're moral people. Just never occurred to him. So that's how this all got started. And then other doctors began publishing things claiming that circumcision will cure alcoholism, cure drug abuse, heal your broken bones, all kinds of wonderful things. But this is also the time where you realize in the United States it became very popular. We used to believe in all these all-cure tonics. Some guy rides up in a wagon and says, I'll sell you this bottle for $20 and it'll cure anything. That's exactly what was happening with circumcision. So it became very popular in the United States until World War II. And after World War II, it began to become less popular when doctors started saying it doesn't help you. There's no benefit to it. So if God did not command it for health reasons, then why? The traditional Jewish and Christian answer is very simple. The purpose was to distinguish Jews from Gentiles. But even this is completely unhelpful to me, because how often do men go around showing off their nakedness to prove that they're Jews? Hey man, I'm circumcised. I mean, really, how does that distinguish you from anybody else? The real way you distinguish a Jew from a Gentile without seeing their foreskin is their clothing, right? You see they dress a certain way and they talk a certain way, and so they're Jews. So circumcision has really very little to do outwardly with how people identify you. Baby Jews don't have any choice either. I mean, they get cut when they're 7 days old or 8 days old, so they didn't say anything about it until you did the cutting. So it was a sign of joining the covenant. But now again, why circumcision? Why would that be a sign of the covenant? These are all why questions, and I agree that why questions are dangerous. Here's the cultural view. The anthropologists and the sociologists, they come up with tribal and cultural ideas. Here's some of their ideas. The men wanted to prove that they're strong and they can handle pain without dying. So they publicly cut it off just to prove how tough they were. Okay, that's one anthropology theory. Okay, fine, but that still doesn't explain why you do it to an 8-day-old baby, right? They're not proving they're tough. Okay, so I admit it's dangerous to ask why questions because God doesn't owe us any explanations. However, if God told people to do something, they should do it whether they know why or not. Fair enough. But God is a God of wisdom, and I can't think of any other times when God demands illogical or inexplicable deeds, especially one that every single male Jew was required to do on penalty of death. So in other words, I think there must be a good reason that we can understand why God would command such a thing. I mean, God does not command us to hop on one foot or pierce our noses or sing Babel every night. And yet one day God says, if you want to be in my covenant, you got to cut the tip off. I mean, that makes no sense if there is no reason. So what I'm saying is there a reason. And I'm not trying to be flippant or irreverent. I'm trying to say that I believe God had a reason, and the reason must be logical, and it must be relevant to holiness. Things are not right or wrong because God says them. They're right or wrong because they're a part of his holy nature. So if you're going to join God's club, that is, join the covenant, that means you're trying to become holy. You're trying to become like God. So there is something in circumcision that is symbolic of holiness. And what could that be? I believe the key is back in Colossians 2:11 through 14. So let's read that again. Colossians 2:11 through 14. In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. So in the Old Testament, in comparing Old Testament circumcision with New Testament baptism, Paul makes this observation. He says, quote, "It is putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ." And he says, we have been cured of this deadness and uncircumcision of our flesh by his resurrection. So Paul is combining these allusions of baptism and circumcision. And it sounds like this. We are born in sin, both in the Old and the New Testament. We are born with the sins of the flesh. That is our sin nature. Jesus saves us from our sin nature and all our other sins also. So circumcision represents the sin nature and our obedience to God in seeking to cut it off from ourselves. In other words, that is our deadness in the sins of Adam. You were born that way before you even cry. You're dead in Adam's nature. So then the question is, why only males and not females? God never commanded female circumcision. So does that mean they weren't born in sin? No, of course not. They are. But there is a difference. They do not pass the sin nature on to their offspring. If you consider, I've been comparing this to the incarnation of Jesus and the virgin birth. Why did Jesus have to be born of a virgin? Not because sex is evil. Sex is not evil. It's because the Adamic sin nature is passed from father to son and daughter. Only men pass whatever we call the sin gene. The original sin passes from the father. That is why Joseph could not be Jesus' father. The Holy Spirit had to implant or create within Mary's womb the sperm in order for Jesus to be born without Adam's sin nature. So, according to my tentative theory, the purpose of circumcision was for the men to always remember that they are the carriers of the sin gene. Now, I don't pretend to know how that happens. Physically, genetically, I don't know why that happens that way. But there is something in the male procreation that passes the sin nature. It is not in the egg of the woman. If it was in the egg of the woman, the Virgin Mary would have made no difference. So the woman gets her sin nature from her father, and the son gets his sin nature from his father. Why? Because God created the man to be the head of the family and to have dominion over his areas of responsibility. It is man who is responsible for the first sin, even though Eve committed the first sin on earth. The planet Earth would not have fallen if only Eve had eaten the fruit. If Adam had refused the fruit, I don't know what would have happened to Eve, but the curse would not have come on the earth or on the ground or on Adam. So creation would not have fallen if Adam hadn't sinned. So, in my theory, the purpose of circumcision was to remind the men that they are the carriers of the sin nature gene and that they pass it to their children. And so the cutting off, the circumcision, the purpose of it was to say, I'm going to try to cut off the sin nature that I'm passing off to everybody else, to all my children. So I will be the holy head of the family and try to change what I have done, what evil I have done. So that's my theory on circumcision. I'm still working on it. I don't know how much more time I'm going to spend on it. I just wanted to find a reason. I think there has to be a reason why God did this, and that it shouldn't be a secret, that there must be some understanding of it. But in the New Testament, the forgiveness of sins ended the cultural dominance of one nation, the Jews, and it also ended the complete domination of men over women. I'm not saying that that men aren't still head of the family, but it is not a patriarchy like it used to be. Now Paul repeatedly says that men and women are equal in Christ. So there is a big change. And it also makes clear that only one parent can sanctify a child. You remember when Paul talks about an unbelieving man who's married to a believing woman, yet the child is sanctified by the wife? In other words, it's not that it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. If the father would be a believer, that would help. But the child can be in the covenant with only one parent now. So there's a number of things that have changed in the New Testament since baptism overcame circumcision. And so they've changed in several ways. But this is an explanation for the problem of circumcision. So, are there any questions or comments? Or laughter? Yes?
In my way of thinking, it's like, where it says old things, that's, what is this, the scripture? Or old things happen and then the new. It's like, that was an old theory, that was the old. And when it was no longer necessary, that's putting on the new.
Yes, the old covenant.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, the old covenant has been superseded by the new covenant. It's the same covenant, but in a different, better manifestation now that Jesus has come. So a lot of the things that were merely ritual are now more symbolic and less painful, partly because the Holy Spirit's within us and changes us.
Okay, and another thing that's going on in my head, it's probably not anywhere near, but like when Christ went up to heaven, and the remnant was torn in half.
The curtain.
That have that kind of a correlation, thinking of the circumcision no longer, this is how it was, and
Right.
when you ascended, this is how it is now.
Yeah, the whole book of Hebrews is about things that have changed since Christ came, and how the old covenant system, we're no longer separated from God by a curtain or by other priests. We have direct contact with God. He lives within us. So yes, a lot of that ritual stuff is no longer required. Yep, that's the change.
That's not a bad thing.
No, it's much simpler. I'm glad we're no longer requiring circumcision. All right, any other?
I guess the Catholics don't read that because they still gotta go through the Pope.
Yes, I don't think the Catholics require circumcision, but they do require you to go through the Pope and priests. Yeah, you have to confess your sins to priests. All right, well, we'll stop there and we'll pick up worship service in about 40 minutes.